welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to another video dedicated to the musical odds and ends that I've been listening to lately. Up for discussion today are releases by four very different acts, ranging from sugary sweet UK harmony pop to all-out atonal free improvisation. So if that sounds interesting, please strap yourself in for some stylistic whiplash, and let's get started. Okay, so we kick off with Visions in a Plaster Sky, the complete late 60s recordings of the Luton-based quartet Wild Silk. Initially inspired by the Shadows and the Beatles, their tale is a familiar one, the group going through multiple name and line-up changes through the earlier part of the decade, all the while working hard on the local pub, club and ballroom circuits, mostly playing cover versions and landing support slots with the likes of The Who and Geno Washington and the Ram Jam Band. Eventually, the core trio of Barry Beasley, Danny Maidment and William Slaney were joined by lead vocalist Alan Davis, during which time the group came to the attention of Shel Talmy, the legendary producer who, in early 1968, signed them under the name Tramline to his production company. However, by the time their first single was released, they were trading under the moniker Wild Silk, shamelessly nicked from a perfume brand of the time apparently. Now, if you're anything like me, you may be aware of Wild Silk via the pair of tracks featured on the Immortal Rubble compilation series, both taken from their second single, the near title track of this collection, Vision in a Plaster Sky, and that song's B-side, Toymaker. Whilst neither one of these is what you'd call a truly wild or freaked out pop psych classic, they're both very pleasant, particularly the former, a minor keyed, acoustic driven, Hollies by way of the moody blues effort, which sounds like it could have come straight from the pen of Graham Gouldman, though is in fact the joint work of German songwriter Henry Mayer and a chap named Lenny Mosley, another Talmy signing of the time. With its droning, modal verses, Beatle-derived harmony breaks, and sound effect-laden coda, the power chord-heavy Toymaker comes a little closer to traditional psychedelia, and yeah, overall they make a pretty nice pairing. Interestingly, due to assorted printing errors on the original 7-inch pressings, for a time it was believed that Ray Davies had written the flip side here, the song even being included on a late 90s bootleg, in amongst assorted rare Kinks recordings. Though it turns out that Toymaker was, in fact, the work of the aforementioned Alan Davis. But what about the rest of the CD, I hear you cry? How many of the remaining 22 songs scratch that eternal itch for obscure pop-psych wonderment? Not that many, unfortunately. Yeah, for example, despite featuring some tantalising flashes of guitar fuzz during its opening and closing bars, Girl, another Alan Davis tune, originally slated to be the A-side of the aforementioned second single, is more of a happy-go-lucky, honeybus-type pop confection. Similarly, the cover of the Randy Newman composition, Burn Down the Cornfield, never really sets alight, the song instead remaining rooted to its rather turgid Beatle groove, then stopping dead just as things are seemingly about to get interesting. Much more satisfying is Just a Game, written by Wild Silk's eventual fifth member, keysman Jim Turner, and, rather confusingly, first issued on the B-side of a single credited to the post-Wild Silk project, Little Bighorn. Now, this is another Beatle-y thumper, sporting some nifty I Am the Walrus type chromatic chordal action, as well as hard-edged guitar work, and with Turner's electric piano run through a Leslie cabinet for swirling lysergic effect. Actually, this is pretty close to the Moles minor classic, We Are the Moles, itself believed to be the Beatles in disguise for a time, though in fact, as we now know, this one was the work of Simon Dupre and the Big Sound. Tucked away at the end of the disc, Fly and The Man Who Knows are two more cool songs from the latter part of Wild Silk's lifespan. These are both up-tempo Davis rockers, still with a foot in the poppy melodicism of the 60s, but with the stinging guitar work and altogether edgier vocal delivery, very much pointing the way towards the hard-rocking early 70s. From what I can gather, Wild Silk weren't permitted to actually play any instruments on their earlier recordings, the duty instead being handed over to veteran session people like Big Jim Sullivan, Nicky Hopkins, and Herbie Flowers, though by the time they were recording this heavier material, they were finally allowed to let rip in the studio, and yeah, by the sounds of things, they could more than cut it. Anyways, that's the most psych-friendly stuff covered. Going back to said earlier material a second, scattered about the CD are the remainder of Wild Silk's single sides, including the yawnsome, middle-of-the-road orchestrated balladry of Help Me, and slightly more entertaining, the Harper's Bizarre cover, Jessie, which apparently doesn't differentiate much from the original, mixing up featherlight, West Coast sunshine pop, with more of that string-heavy, mid-tempo stodge. Best of this little bunch is probably Jessie's B-side, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, a catchy sliver of none more 60s pleasantry, supporting a lyric focused on day-to-day, kitchen sink type observations. This was actually another Alan Davis tune, erroneously credited to the completely unrelated Ray Davis. Funnily enough, Wild Silk did actually record a couple of versions of the Kinks' early classic, Tired of Waiting for You, one of which belatedly saw the light of day as a 1971 single A-side, albeit credited to Cotton Socks, a bogus name that Shel Talmy slapped on the disc without the group's knowledge. The less said about this turgid trudge, though, the better. So yeah, speaking as the sort of person that regularly takes a punt on comprehensive collections by these types of obscure 60s bands, overall, this is certainly one of the harder ones to recommend. If you're a hopeless case like me, at a push, I'd say that maybe half the songs here are worth having, whereas the rest barely warrant a mention, comprising of further lame cover versions, a couple of annoying novelty tunes, and a truckload more of that overly orchestrated, syrupy ballad slush. Much of this stuff was unreleased at the time, and sat in the vaults for almost 50 years, and yeah, you can kinda hear why, unfortunately. So that was Wild Silk for you. Next up is something even more outside of what I normally talk about on the channel. Now Look, the second solo LP by Ronnie Wood. Yeah, all the CDs I'm talking about today are stored right next to each other in the same box, so I figured I may as well say a few words about this one too, whilst it's out and getting listened to. As you might expect from an album created in the dying days of Wood's time with the Faces, just before he joined the Rolling Stones, Now Look sounds a heck of a lot like a halfway house between those two bands. Yeah, consisting mostly of no-nonsense, organic grooving, and drawing on a satisfying melting pot of rootsy influences. Every track is imbued with a nicely intimate, late-night session kind of feeling. Though far from being some mindless, unstructured boogie fest, most of the tunes here are actually pretty tightly focused, with minimal pentatonic noodling, and enough twists and turns in the songwriting and arrangements to lift the album above being a bluesy snooze-a-thon. That's not to say there aren't moments on here where you wish the assembled talents had come up with something slightly more inspired. Yeah, whilst it's a fun little tune, Big Bayou, written by one-time Flying Burrito brother Jib Gilbo, it's a sort of good time rave-up you've no doubt heard a million times before. Whereas the little segued medley, comprising of Caribbean boogie and the title tune, seems a bit half-written. And whilst they're perfectly listenable, a couple of the straighter R&B cuts don't really go anywhere. At its best, though, Now Look is actually really enjoyable. The legendary Bobby Womack co-produced the LP with Wood and fellow face Ian McLagan, the pair also lending a hand in the songwriting department. The Wood-Womack co-write that opens the record, I Got Lost When I Found You, is a steamy, minor key strut with some tasty diminished chord action, adding a frisson of dissonance to proceedings, and a subtly complex structure to keep you on your toes. Now Look closes in a similarly soulful and sultry fashion with the yearning I Got a Feeling, a joint effort between Womack, McLagan, and keyboard wizard Jean Roussel, which definitely points the way forward to the sound the Stones would adopt later on in the decade, particularly on hits like Miss You. In between these two bookends, we get altogether more rockin' fare like I Can Say She's All Right, featuring Keith Richards himself on guest axe duties, though to my ears this ends up sounding more like something from the Derek and the Dominoes LP sessions, the tune even referencing the unmistakable Layla riff on a couple of occasions. Mick Taylor, the man Wood obviously went on to replace in the Stones, then crops up on It's Unholy, contributing some suitably wicked slide guitar action to its sweaty swamp funk groove, the tune ending up the jammiest thing on the LP, concluding with an extended bout of spirited group improvisation, its epic fade-out suggesting that there's perhaps a barnstorming side-long version sitting in a vault somewhere. My favourite of all, though, is Breathe on Me, a gorgeous slice of cosmic country melancholia, with McLagan's spectral organ washes and occasional flashes of backmasked cymbals and pedal steel guitar, lending the song a gently psychedelic atmosphere, which is always welcome in my world. In truth, I may never have even thought of picking the album up if I hadn't caught this song playing on the radio a year or two back. Sadly, there's nothing else even remotely like it elsewhere on Now Look, but all in all, the more I hear the album, the more I like it. Yeah, if like me, you've long since burnt out on the Stones classics, or if you're underwhelmed by the faces, then you may just get something out of this low-key, understated little effort. Next up, let's take a look at the pair of albums by Wooden Horse, a Brit-based, early 70s group, originally from Australia, and perhaps best known for being fronted by Susan Traynor, who later found fame in the group Fox, by which time she was trading under the name Nusha Fox. Now, despite being a long-time obsessive of the psych folk and folk rock boom of the late 60s and beyond, and despite knowing of the group for the best part of 2 decades probably, I only got around to picking up these CDs relatively recently. Their self-titled debut originally saw the light of day in 1972, and whilst it's decent enough, it's far from being the why did I not pick this up sooner gem that I was hoping for. Yeah, instead of slotting in with combos like the Incredible String Band and their mystical, esoteric ilk, Wooden Horse were obviously way more enthralled to the gentle, laid-back sounds emanating from the west coast of the USA. Opening with a trio of harmony-drenched, countrified numbers, part Crosby, Stills and Nash, part Peter, Paul and Mary, it isn't until Northern Beaches that we get something a bit more interesting. This brooding, atmospheric mini-epic obviously draws heavily from moody minor key classics like David Crosby's Guinevere and Joni Mitchell's Woodstock, whilst also hinting at the trippy raga folk fusions of Magic Carpet in its exploratory coda. Unfortunately, the psychedelic spell is broken all too soon, as we're plunged headfirst into the cornerly sentimental hippy-dippyisms of This Is a Song, and even worse, the honky-tonk hoedown Broken Bottles, which could pass for one of Trevor Lucas's tedious, third-rate Robbie Robertson rip-offs. Thankfully, Eastbound Train is a definite improvement, a breezily melancholic and wistful number in the vein of Simon and Garfunkel, whilst a similarly poignant, gentle Mind takes the influence one step further, threatening to morph into April Come She Will on a few occasions. Anyone hoping for at least a touch more trippiness before the LP's close may get something out of the propulsive mountain music of Feel, though that's about it really. The last two songs, Letter and Loving Man, take us back to the slick, polished country folk sound of the opening cuts. By the time of 1973's follow-up effort, the imaginatively titled Wooden Horse 2, the group had expanded their lineup a little to include drummer Bob Irwin and woodwinds player Dave Young. Picking up right where the first album left off, with the happy-go-lucky country rocking of Celebration Song, the group's almost eponymous number, Wooden Horses, then hints pleasingly at a more Brit-derived sound. Its curious instrumental intro, sporting a lovely section for pastoral flute and monochordal acoustic guitar, before, rather disappointingly, it's mostly back to the faux Americanisms for the remainder of the piece. That said, for my money, this is a much better song overall than the clutch of rather bland saloon bar strum-alongs that follow. And unfortunately, things don't really get any more exciting for the remainder. The LP passing by in a mellow haze of cosy Jackson Browne and Elton Johnisms, with most of the lead vocal work being carried by David Mattia. Towards the back end of the record, I suppose it's fair to say that On This Day returns us at least in part to the modal moodiness of Northern Beaches from the debut, whilst Malcolm Harrison's closer, typewriter and guitar, starts life as a hushed, reflective downer ballad, the kind you might find on albums by private press loaners like Bob Desper or John Palmer, before getting a bit more hippified in its closing moments, the producer hitting the faders far too soon though, just as Young starts chipping in with some more of that lovely flute. So yeah, not my favourite band of merry folk rockers by any stretch. Yeah, I admit I was pretty underwhelmed when I first got these albums, and unfortunately, my putting them under the magnifying glass for this video hasn't exactly made me warm to Wooden Horse. Perhaps I'm in the minority here. Yeah, from what I've read online, their slim discography is actually quite well regarded. As I said, the debut is mostly perfectly pleasant and listenable, though save for the two psych-leaning tunes, it's all very safe. More of a comfy campfire sing-along than a weird and wild pagan freak-out in the woods. Then yeah, by the time of the second LP, a monster rarity on vinyl due to it being withdrawn soon after release, the material just isn't strong or distinctive enough, the band leaning way too heavily on that generic West Coast sound for my taste. Okay, so as promised, let's wash away the saccharine taste of melodicism with some improv freakery. Yeah, this is Sunrise from West Sea, live, by Yamash'ta The Horizon, originally a Japanese-only release from 1971, which was belatedly given the reissue treatment by the French label We Want Sounds in 2022. This particular one-off improv supergroup was headed up by the multi-instrumentalist and experimentalist Stomu Yamash'ta, with Japanese traditional instrument specialist Hideakira Sakurai, keys player and serial band former Masahiko Sato, and Fluxus member and founder of the Taj-Mahal Travellers, Takehisa Kosugi, providing the backing. Now, there are just 2 side long pieces here. The first one opens sparsely and quietly, with some lightly reverbed folk horror violin scraping from Kosugi, whilst dark wisps of Sato's treated organ skulk about in the shadows, occasionally lurching forward into ear-tickling blasts of white noise or high single tones, which float about the auditorium like sonic ghosts. As the performance drifts along, Yamash'ta and fellow percussionist / shamisen and electric koto man Sakurai gradually make their presence felt with assorted plucks, knocks and rumblings, eventually building up a head of steam, with the latter going nuts on said arsenal of traditional Japanese instruments. Things then wind down again into sci-fi nightmare territory, Sato chipping in with some hazy organ grotesquerie, whilst what sounds suspiciously like a theremin ups the spooky alien vibes, before altogether more organic and earthy hand drumming grounds the piece, stopping it from floating off completely into outer space. In the midst of all this percussive thunder, after a few tentative interjections, the previously restrained Kosugi suddenly goes hell for leather, stomping on a fuzz pedal and turning his violin into a swarm of angry bees, the piece then fading out on garbled, electronically treated vocal confusion. So yeah, so far so weird. The second piece opens with yet more arrhythmic hand drumming, punctuated with occasional grunts and yelps, which gradually fade out into a section of rather morose-sounding metallic scraping. Perhaps sensing that things are momentarily getting a bit aimless, Sakurai gives the piece a shot in the arm with some dramatic string strikes, which seem to wake everyone else up from their slumber, the players then locking into a weird zombified pulse. This soon breaks down into bassy percussion menace and smears of stark, wintry violin, before the mood lightens, possibly somewhat inadvertently, with the reappearance of the strange electronic vocal modifications, which seem to audibly amuse a few audience members. The performers soon see to this, though, drowning out their mirth with the most overwhelmingly intimidating climax of the set, with minutes on end of distressed elephant calls, piercing steel drum hammering, and layers of white noise destruction, concluding this most intriguing 30-odd minutes of music. I'd like to think that the long fade out here suggests that Yamash'ta and The Horizon carried on for several more minutes in order to punish the crowd for their unruliness. Anyways, this is certainly an interesting little release. Whilst it's not the mind-melting freak-out super session to end them all, if you enjoy a more exploratory, genre-blurring approach to improv, then I can certainly recommend it to fans of the aforementioned Taj-Mahal Travellers, as well as some of the more out there, fringe stuff from 1970s Germany, and the free folk movement from the 90s and noughties. I can also highly recommend the huge 5-disc box set, The Heliopolar Egg by Hartmut Gierken and Michael Ranter, which I reviewed not too long back, and was actually recorded partially in Japan in collaboration with local musicians. So yeah, as promised, quite a varied selection here. If you've enjoyed this video, please do hit subscribe and check out the archive for similar content. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time on the Acid Trash Jamboree.